Hello and thank you. And my special greetings not only to everybody here today in this room, but to all of our brothers and sisters around the world who are watching this conference live. Welcome to everybody, and I appreciate your welcome. My name is Patrick Madrid, and I have a little radio program on Relevant Radio. I don't know if any of you get a chance to hear it up here, but in a little bit I'm going to share with you how you can access Relevant Radio as a tool that you can use in your evangelization efforts. It'll involve the Relevant Radio app. In fact, why don't we just do that now, just to give you an idea of how you can evangelize your family and friends. I have some suggestions on how you can do that specifically. But those of you with an iPhone or an Android phone, if it's a smartphone, take a second and go to your app store, wherever you are in the world, Australia, England, wherever you are. Go to your app store and in the search bar, type in Relevant Radio, and you should see it pop up almost immediately. It'll have a little image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, kind of a bluish image of Our Lady. And when you tap on that, it will start loading it. It's free. And when it's finished loading, it'll take about 10, 15 seconds. Then the app will appear on your phone, as all the other apps do. And from there, you'll be able to listen live to 24/7 Catholic radio anywhere in the world, as long as you have a connection to the internet or to a cell signal. So you'll be able to tie in with and plug in with a huge amount of evangelization information and encouragement and tools and resources on a daily basis. If you go to the upper left section of the app once it loads, there's a little pull-down menu, and press the third one down, which is Shows, and that will populate all the different Relevant Radio programs. Mine, I think, has a green frame, if I'm not mistaken. You'll see my smiling face on there. And if you press that, then you'll have access to all of the shows that I do. It's a 3-hour program every day, Monday through Friday, from 9 a.m. to noon. That's Eastern time, by the way. And you will be able to see hour by hour, day by day, all the topics that are covered. So you might say, oh, he's talking about Canada, or oh, he talked about some other issue that you might find interesting. You can zero in specifically by topic if you wish. You can search by topic. You can listen to any of the back shows they're all posted there. And then you can also set an alarm so that if you forget that the Patrick Madrid show is starting at 9 a.m. Eastern time, you'll be able to set the alarm, then the app will wake up and tell you, start listening to the program. So that is the first of the suggestions I'd like to make to you, which is to not only for you to get the Relevant Radio app on your phone or your device, but to encourage your family members to do so as well. Here's why. Here's why I'm beginning with this. Would you agree with me that people are more or less, especially younger people, are more or less addicted to their cell phones? Would that ring true for you? I have to admit, I have to fight the addiction too, because I find myself constantly looking at my news feed, Twitter, that kind of thing. I interact with people all over the world on Twitter. My address is @PatrickMadrid, if anybody is interested in connecting with me that way. But I find that this is a very helpful way to evangelize, and to evangelize your family members especially. I'll give you some examples. Quick show of hands. How many of you know somebody who has left the Catholic Church? And all the hands go up. How many of you have ever been faced with a difficult question about your Catholic faith, maybe even just believing in God, that you didn't have a good answer for? Anyone ever been in that situation? How many of you do not like to be asked to raise your hands in public? May I see that? Most of the hands went back up. Well, the reason this particular issue is so important, in my view, is because technology is our friend. When it comes to sharing the faith, let's go where the people are. Let's go where your sons and daughters are actually looking. And you know as well as I do that everybody's doing this all day long. Everybody is looking at their phone all day long. So that's where we need to go. It's not the only place, but that's a place that we need to go. And here are some of the ways that you can do that. Number one, on my radio program, I receive calls all the time from parents who are wondering, what can I do to help my son or my daughter, or sons and daughters, as the case may be, come back to their faith? Because we raised them strong in the Catholic faith. My son was an altar boy. My daughter was involved in the parish, and we scrimped and saved to send them to Catholic school. And by the time they got to college, they became atheists. Or they became so secularized that they look at the Catholic faith as something ridiculous, or perhaps even something that should be opposed because of our traditional teachings on marriage and sexuality and other issues like that. How do I reach them? This is a question I hear all the time. Well, one way to do it, and perhaps the easiest way to do it, is through their cell phone. So you can send them clips from audio things that you hear. The Patrick Madrid show is just one example, but Relevant Radio has tons of those kinds of audio clips that are prepackaged. They're maybe 2 or 3 minutes long. Just text it to your son or daughter. They will listen to it. If a link pops up, they will press it and they will listen to it. Send them video clips. Let's say that somebody you know has headed down the road of atheism, and they believe that if you believe in God, you are to be pitied because you are superstitious and probably ignorant, perhaps prone to violence, and you're anti-scientific. Perhaps you've heard those kinds of charges before leveled at believers. I'm sure you have. Well, there is a wealth of information out there, such as debates between Catholics and other Christians with leading atheists. They're on YouTube. One example, there is a well-known debate. It's between William Lane Craig, he's a Christian philosopher, and the late Christopher Hitchens, who I'm quite certain is no longer an atheist now, but may he rest in peace. Christopher Hitchens was one of the group of prominent modern atheists known as the Four Horsemen of atheism. So Richard Dawkins was another one, Sam Harris. Christopher Hitchens, a British fellow, very articulate, very persuasive in the way he speaks. I mean, I could listen to him. I mean, as an American, I just really enjoy this lilting accent that he had. I could listen to Christopher Hitchens reading from the telephone book and find that interesting. Most people find Christopher Hitchens persuasive until they hear his anti-theist beliefs critiqued. And that's what happens in this debate with William Lane Craig. This is just one example of this. So let's say, to start with the issue of atheism, let's say that somebody you know is enamored of atheism and truly believes that the atheist arguments are persuasive. Let that person watch a debate between one of the top atheists and a Christian, and stand back and see what happens. These debates are available readily on YouTube. Just search for Catholic atheist debate, Christian atheist debate. And what I can guarantee you is, because I've seen this happen many times myself, is that if you text a YouTube link, especially to a young person, that person will watch it. And the more of these they get, it doesn't have to be, bombardment. You don't have to send one every day. But if, every few weeks or something, hey, by the way, I saw this atheist debating, and he was trying to disprove the belief in God. Check it out. Well, they will. So that's another area that you can do this with. A third area would be with digital downloads of material from groups like Lighthouse Catholic Media. I'm not sure if they have their kiosks in churches here in Canada, do they? That's good to know. They've proliferated throughout the United States, and I always enjoy walking into a church, and I know that the audience will be very well educated in Catholic matters, because if I see a Catholic Lighthouse Media or Lighthouse Catholic Media kiosk, I know that the people there have been being fed on a steady diet of this information. These are wonderful tools also, because you can just simply, for pennies, you can get one of these digital download links on a specific topic and then send it to your son or your daughter, your coworker, your friend. These are things also that in the area of YouTube videos and such, you're able to put these on Facebook, Twitter, things like that. This is the second big area. In addition to Catholic radio and YouTube, social media is a huge way to evangelize your family and friends. And I love the old saying that if you want to start an argument, take a stand on some position on social media, and before you know it, you will find yourself being challenged by somebody. It happens to me all the time on Twitter. If you go through my Twitter feed, you'll see all kinds of these things that tend to erupt. But that's good, because it gets people to thinking. So in your use of Facebook and Twitter, or whatever social media platforms you're on, I'm not suggesting that you solely do the work of evangelization, but I am suggesting that you season your posts with things that are likely to cause people to think. Videos are great, links to articles are great, links to radio programs, or even perhaps from EWTN, a television program there that you might have found helpful. By putting these links out there, people can actually benefit from them in the privacy of their own homes. And a great example to us is the great Saint Francis de Sales. I'm not sure how familiar you are with his story, but just to give you a bit of historical background, he, as a young priest, he was about 28 years old, he was given permission by his bishop to go into the Chablais region of France, which now is not only the eastern part of France, but also the area in Switzerland that surrounds Geneva. And this area had been under the strict, you might say, domination, if that's the right word, of Calvinism for over 60 years. And the Catholic faith was illegal there in this area. And so when St. Francis de Sales, this young priest, he was given permission to go there, nobody would listen to him. Nobody would come to Mass. Nobody would come and hear him speak when he would give a public lecture. And it was very frustrating for him, not to mention there was a great deal of hostility. There are stories that he told about, for example, when he was riding from one town to the next and a farmer saw that this was a Catholic priest, he set his dogs on him and he had to climb up into a tree to get away from the dogs, and the dogs wouldn't leave, and it was getting dark, so he used a rope or a belt or something, and he tied himself to the branch of a tree so he could sleep without falling out of the tree. And by the following morning, the dogs had left, so he was able to resume his trek to the next town. But Francis de Sales did something that I think is very similar to what we can do today when it comes to evangelizing, and that is he used the social media of his day, which was the printing press. So he would compose these responses to the challenges that were raised. And this, by the way, is apologetics. The Bible says to always be ready to give a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, but do it with gentleness and respect. I love that verse. I love the gentleness and respect part of it especially. But that word, the word defense, sometimes is translated into English as explanation. That word in the Greek is apologion, from which we get the word apologetics. And apologetics, just as a quick aside here, does not mean picking the other guy up by the lapels and trying to shake sense into him. Apologetics does not mean arguing. Apologetics is not pre-Vatican II or anti-ecumenical or any of the things that I think some people erroneously assume. Apologetics is simply the friendly, charitable, patient, respectful explanation of why you believe what you believe. That's what it is. So when a coworker says to you, "You believe in God?" That's superstitious. Or that's anti-scientific. How could you believe in God when science has proven that God doesn't exist, which obviously it hasn't, nor can it? But in any case, when you're faced with a question like that, you have one of a couple of options. One option would be to say, no, I'm not superstitious, and then you walk away. The second option might be to get into an argument. How dare you call me superstitious? The third option would be to engage in apologetics, which is a respectful, well, I don't believe I'm superstitious, nor am I anti-scientific, and let me explain why. And then you begin sharing the rational case for believing in God, which we don't have time to go into here, but it is readily available in some of the things that I described to you as resources, including on my program. Every day we get into this a lot. And just as another quick aside, I find that there are many atheists and agnostics who listen to the program, and they will call in. And sometimes they'll call in to challenge, and they'll be very aggressive against theism. So that's another good reason why you should listen to the Patrick Madrid show, because I'm giving you the honest reasons why. Because you may feel unprepared to go toe-to-toe with whoever it might be challenging your belief in God, your belief in Jesus, your Catholic faith, what have you. You may feel unprepared, nervous, inadequate. We all get into those situations. I know what it's like. But on the radio show, you will hear how to do that. You will not only hear the kind of arguments that you're accustomed to hearing when somebody challenges you, but you're also going to hear how to respond to those arguments in a way that doesn't seek to be angry with the other person or drive that person away, but to really help the other person, including a convinced atheist, understand how to do apologetics, how to make the case for your belief in God. Now, back to St. Francis de Sales. He would compose these responses in the form of little, you might call them tracts or leaflets, and then at his own expense, he would have them printed up by the hundreds and thousands. And his trick was, every morning early, when he would distribute these, he would get up before it was even light out, and he and his helpers would go door to door throughout the neighborhoods in Geneva, and they would slide these little tracts under the doors of the homes, so that when mom and dad got up and got ready to start the workday, they'd find this little Catholic leaflet sitting inside their home, and they would pick it up and have their morning coffee, and they would read it. And little by little, because there was no negative peer pressure, their neighbors weren't, getting mad at them. Why did you go hear that priest talk? Because everybody was in the privacy of his own home. Just like when people are like this with their phones, they have a certain privacy. They can listen to radio, they can look at the audio link or look at the video links and things like that. And little by little, this will have an effect, as it did for those people. Eventually, the townspeople in Geneva and the surrounding areas, they began to attend his masses. They began to attend his public lectures. They began to attend some of the public debates that he actually would have with ministers who opposed the Catholic Church. And the amazing thing is, by the time St. Francis de Sales finished the course of his earthly life, he became the Bishop of Geneva. It is said that he converted, perhaps single-handedly converted, over 60,000 souls back to the Catholic faith with something as simple as a printing press and some paper. So if the great St. Francis de Sales, with his dogged determination, could bring back into the practice of the Catholic faith 60,000 people with just those tools, imagine what you and I could do with social media, with YouTube videos, with Catholic radio, with links to great material like that. I'm a huge believer in this, and I really want to emphasize how important that is. The second thing, I know, because my family is probably no different than yours, that there's always going to be some kind of fault line in family relationships that make it difficult for us to evangelize our own family. I understand that. Family weirdness knows no boundaries. It knows no borders. It's everywhere, and all of our families have it. And since that's a given, we should accept things the way they are and work around those problems. You all know the story of St. Augustine and how he was raised in a Catholic home by his mother, St. Monica. And although Augustine, as a boy, had not yet been baptized, in his Confessions, he describes how his mother, not his father, because his father was this sort of pagan who didn't really take much interest in the Catholic faith until he was about to die. But his mother was very good in raising Augustine in a stable and wholesome home that kept God at the center of their life. And yet, when Augustine was a youth, he began to get into the 4th century equivalent of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And he writes about that in his book, The Confessions. And he's very forthright about this. And he talks about how it began with things like stealing fruit from a neighbor's orchard, and that progressed to other things. Before you know it, he's in the party scene, he's sleeping around, and he describes himself in the Confessions. He says, "I was an abyss of sin." And I don't think it takes much imagination to figure out all the things that he was talking about. He also got connected with an odd cult-like group, the Manichaeans. And so he was interested in rhetoric and philosophy and knowledge and wisdom and this secret information that the Manichaeans promised their adherents that they would receive that other people didn't get. And so he was not only absorbed by the cares of the world and the flesh and all of the delights of the flesh, but he was also interested in the world of ideas. So his poor mother, she saw him drifting further and further away. Eventually, he fathered a child out of wedlock, and I think it's not a great stretch to say that he was very much like a 21st century young person nowadays in his appetites and in his interests. Well, his mom, St. Monica, got to the point where she couldn't take it anymore, and she kept trying to argue with Augustine and come back in and believe in God again, and Augustine wouldn't listen, and she was speaking to St. Ambrose, who was the Bishop of Milan. And Ambrose very wisely said, Monica, now it's time for you to speak less to Augustine about God and speak more to God about Augustine. And she did. And it doesn't mean that she stopped speaking to Augustine entirely, but it means that she recognized that the true focus of her energies must be on prayer for Augustine. And I can only imagine what a relentless battering ram Saint Monica was when it came to prayer for her son. But look at what happened. He did come back. He did have a powerful reconversion experience. In fact, as he tells it himself in the Confessions, he describes how he was in a garden and he heard a voice of a child. Maybe it was the Christ child. Maybe it was his guardian angel. I'm not sure. But he heard a voice of a child saying, tolle et lege, which means from the Latin, pick it up and read it. And he did. He was reading scripture and he had an on-the-spot conversion experience. And St. Monica was nowhere in the area. This was the byproduct of her prayers. So my second suggestion here with regard to family is not only acknowledge the family weirdness that exists, but seek alternative ways to get around that family weirdness. When I say family weirdness, what I mean is people can be weird in that they may say, well, who are you to tell me about Jesus and, all these Catholic things? I knew you back when you used to smoke pot. So who are you to tell me this? Or maybe it's another family member who won't listen to you because there's some old family grudge that nobody even remembers anymore, but it causes resistance. And there are many other examples of what this is. So what I'm driving at here is that St. Monica's prayers were beneficial because she was consistent and persistent. Another connection to this would be from Acts chapter 8. And I would encourage you, especially parents, to ponder the second half of Acts chapter 8, in which we see the story of the Ethiopian eunuch who was riding around in his chariot out in the desert. And we're told that God sent, in a seemingly sort of miraculous way, he sent Philip, perhaps the deacon Philip, perhaps the apostle Philip, we're not entirely sure, but he sent Philip out to the desert to speak to this Ethiopian eunuch. And when he presents himself, he says, what are you reading? He says, well, I'm reading from this scroll. And Philip says, do you understand what you're reading? And the eunuch says, how can I unless somebody explains it to me? So Philip says, I'll explain it to you. So then he proceeds to explain to the eunuch that he was reading from the scroll of Isaiah about Jesus, about the prophecies that pointed to Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. And the whole moral of this story is that under the direction and the teaching of Philip, the Ethiopian eunuch had a conversion experience on the spot. And he says to Philip, he says, what's preventing me from being baptized now? Look, there's some water right there. I could be baptized right now, can't I? And sure enough, he was. And then we're told at the end of this story that just as quickly as the Lord had sent Philip to talk to the Ethiopian eunuch, he then mysteriously sent him to some other place to do some good for somebody else. Here's why this story is important. Because you can be praying for a Philip to come into the life of that family member of yours who will not listen to you. So as parents, if you're grinding your teeth and you're frustrated because nothing that you say seems to get through to your son or daughter or to your brother-in-law, your sister-in-law, pray for a Philip. And I firmly believe, especially for parents, because you have tremendous standing in God's eyes. You have a special privileged position in God's eyes as the parents of these children. Your prayers have a special place in God's favor when it comes to granting the desire of your heart that your children will come back to the practice of the faith. So you can sit back with a contented smile on your face, and your son or daughter will have no clue what's about to hit him, because a Philip in due time will arrive. And maybe it will take many Philips. Maybe it will take a variety of different things, but it will happen in due time. I firmly believe that. I also recommend that you give out good reading material. Now, I have a special experience with a series of books that I edited. They're called Surprised by Truth. The reason I want to take a moment and mention these is because I don't know how to explain it other than God's grace, and I can't take any credit for it personally, but these stories of conversion in the Surprised by Truth books are, in a way that I can't fully comprehend, they have a special anointing They have a special power, and untold numbers of miracles have occurred with people getting a copy of this. I'll give you a couple quick examples. I was speaking in Albuquerque years ago, and a woman came up to the book table where I was signing books, and she pointed to the book, and she said, "That book brought me back to the Catholic faith." I said, "Really? Tell me, what happened?" She said, "Well, I was raised in a Catholic home. My parents, did everything that they could to teach us the faith. But when I got out of high school, I decided, to heck with that, I want to have a fun time." So she said she became a kind of a party girl when she went off to college. And she just said, "I lived a wild life." And I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't need an explanation. I had a pretty good idea what she was talking about. She said she lived a wild life, and for maybe the next 10 years or so, 15, 20 years perhaps it was, I think it was 20 years, she said she never gave God a second thought. She never went to Mass, she never prayed. All she cared about was indulging her appetites and having a good time. She said she was on a vacation, and I think she was hiking or camping out in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota, and she happened to go into a one-room post office in this little podunk town in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota because she wanted to mail some postcards. She goes into this one-room post office, she's talking to the clerk, and somehow it comes out in the conversation that she used to be a Catholic. And she made some comment like, "Well, yeah, I'm a recovering Catholic," or, "I've got all that Catholic guilt," or something like that. And the postal clerk said, "Oh, really? You're a former Catholic?" He said, "Well, then you need to read this book." And he pulled out a copy of the Surprised by Truth book from under the counter. And she said, "Oh, I can't take your book. I appreciate it, but I can't take your book." He says, "No problem. I have a whole stack of them here under the counter." He says, "I keep them here for people just like you." So she's like, wow. So she takes a copy of the book. She goes back to her cabin or her tent or wherever it was. She said she starts leafing through it. And she's actually got tears in her eyes now as she's telling me this story. She said, "I started reading these stories," and she said, "I was so mesmerized and I was so blown away by these testimonies." She said, when I finished reading it, I put the book down. She said, "I got in my car and I went to the nearest sizable town, and I found a Catholic church, and I went to confession that very day for the first time in 20 years. And she said it was because the stories spoke to her in a way that got through. Who knows what her parents were saying, who knows what anyone else was saying, but it was that testimony of these people giving their examples of why they became Catholic that reached her. Another example. This is shortly after the first volume came out, I guess it was, and I received an email from a guy who was attending Regent University in Virginia. This is a detail that I remember, and it's an important one because it's a Protestant university and it has a prominent law school. And this Catholic fellow sent me an email saying, "By the way, I just want to say thank you for this book because I'm the only Catholic in my law school class, and everyone else is evangelical Protestant, and they are trying very hard to get me out of the Catholic Church because they don't believe that the Catholic Church is Christian and that kind of thing." So he said, "When I found this book, it was a real help to me, and I just want to say thank you." That was the whole email. So I sent him back an email, and I said, "Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you." And I said, on a lark, I said, "Well, if I were to send you at my expense, and I'll pay the UPS bill, if I send you a case of the book, would you be willing to just hand them out to all the people who are giving you a hard time?" And he said, "Sure, I'll do that." So I shipped him off a case of the books, like 40 copies or something like that. And I don't remember all these years later whether or not I ever heard from him again. It was like putting a note in a bottle and tossing it into the Atlantic Ocean. Well, what happened was I was speaking somewhere else, and this is like 15 years later, and during the book signing section, a guy comes up to me and he says, "That book brought me back to my Catholic faith." I said, "Really, what happened?" He said, "Well, I was in law school. This was at Regent University. And there was this Catholic guy that we were constantly haranguing about Christianity. And one day he comes in with a box of books on his shoulder, and he starts giving away all these books. He says, I got a copy of the book, and I was really moved by it, and one thing led to another, and I became Catholic. So at Franciscan University of Steubenville, where I speak every summer at the Defending the Faith Conference, that is the last weekend of July, for those of you who might be interested in attending. It's well worth your time, by the way. I told that story. And everybody was like, oh, wow, that is awesome. That book, one of the books helped this guy come back to the Catholic Church or come into the Catholic Church. Well, when I was done, I went and sat down, and a fellow came over to me, and he said, that story that you told? I said, yeah. He says, there's more to that story than you realize. I said, really? He said, I was in that class at Regent University. And he said, I was adamantly opposed to this Catholic guy's Catholic faith, and he said, he gave me a copy of the book, one thing led to another, I wound up becoming Catholic. And I said, wow. And he says, oh, it's better than that. He says, look back there in the back of the room. He says, see that priest over there? I said, yeah. He was in the class. He was studying to be a lawyer, and he got a copy of the book, and now he is a Catholic priest serving the Lord in his church as a Catholic priest. And then he named off like 2 or 3 other people, one of whom became a canon lawyer, one of whom was married. And he said, these are just the people I know of in that class who wound up becoming Catholic. So this is like the gift that keeps on giving, this one box of books. And who knows, I mean, I think it's going to be a fun reunion for all those people when they get to heaven and say, oh, you too, you had the book, you had the class. So the moral to the story here is that you should not be afraid to give people things like a book, or be sneaky. And when people come visit you, put it on the back of the toilet, put it on the top of the tank of the toilet. You have a captive audience. Leave them laying around. Send them to people. Send CDs, send books. Don't be afraid to do that. I mean, what have you got to lose? Nothing. And the potential dividends are vast. Now, if there were time, I would tell you, I have a whole file at home in my archives of the letters and the emails of things that people have told me about receiving. And this is not a commercial for that book. What I'm saying is, it could be any book. Don't be afraid to be promiscuous in giving away those kinds of materials, because they do have a powerful effect more often than not. And the problem really is that we just don't do it. The other thing is, in preparation for evangelizing the family, in addition to being clever about what you send, videos, Catholic radio, etc., in addition to not being worried about sharing books and things like that, we also have to prepare ourselves. And this is something that we're doing right now at this conference, here in this room, in whatever location you happen to be at right now watching this. We have to prepare ourselves. Now, obviously, the spiritual component is vital, because if we're not spiritually engaged, if we're not true disciples of the Lord Jesus Christ, if we're not truly believers in what we profess as Catholics, we will be, I believe, like what St. Paul described in 1 Corinthians 13, we'll be tinkling cymbals and clanging gongs. We're not going to be able to get much accomplished. So the first and most obvious part is we have to be believers ourselves, and people need to see that in us. You can evangelize when you're in a restaurant without ever saying anything to anyone else, simply by making the sign of the cross and saying your grace before you eat a meal. I was in Chicago's airport, Chicago O'Hare. This is years ago, and I had a connection that was, an hour or two long. So I stopped at one of the restaurants, and I know this place. Every time I go by it, I think about what happened. It's between the G and the H concourse in the American Airlines terminal, and I'm there often enough that I keep seeing this place. And I see the place that I was sitting in that restaurant. I went in there, and I'm having my lunch, and I was there for, 40 minutes or something like that. And when I was finished, I paid the bill and got my bag, and I'm getting up to leave. A guy comes over. He was sitting several tables away. I didn't notice him, but he came over to me and he said, "Excuse me, are you Patrick Madrid?" I said, "Yes." And I was worried, like, did I have food in my mustache, or, did I do something embarrassing? And he said, "I thought that was you." He said, "But I knew it was you when I saw you make the sign of the cross and you said your prayers." And I said, "Oh, well, thank you." He said, "I never do that." He said, "But watching you do that made me realize I need to start doing that, because you just sort of touched me in a way that I wasn't really expecting, and I wanted to say thank you." So we shook hands. I gave him my card. I've never seen the guy again, but it was interesting to me how evangelization can take a very simple form like that. When you put yourself out there, you will feel uncomfortable, especially if you're in a setting where people will notice you making the sign of the cross and saying your prayers. People will notice that, but people will make decisions on the basis of that. And you might actually be helping somebody come back to the Catholic faith or even into the Catholic faith for the first time by something as simple as evangelizing through your actions in a public place and using this as one example, saying your prayers, make the sign of the cross. Don't be afraid to do that. St. Paul says in Romans chapter 1, I am not ashamed of the gospel. So that's a great little light that you and I can shine in a public place. We have to be intellectually prepared. We ourselves have to be doing enough study so that we can answer the questions, so that we can have the ability to know where the answers to the questions might be. Catholic Answers is a wonderful resource. I'm sure you've heard of Catholic Answers. Their website is hard to forget. It's Catholic.com. It doesn't get any easier than that, does it? Catholic.com. I used to work at Catholic Answers long ago. I was there for 8 great years. And I can tell you that there is no question, there is no challenge, there is nothing that anybody can present to you that is not answered decisively and convincingly in some way or another, in a video, a tract, an article, that is not present at Catholic Answers website, Catholic.com. So whether you're dealing with people who are coming at this from a religious perspective, an atheist perspective, doesn't matter, make use of Catholic.com, type in the keywords, whatever the issue may be, you're going to find something there, and then share that. Coming back to my thesis about sending people these things, the easiest evangelization tool that you have at your fingertips is literally at your fingertips. It's your phone. And I propose texting people. It's better even than emailing them. Just text it to them because it pops up and everybody's going to press the link and read it. So we have to be intellectually prepared. And also, lastly, we have to be prepared emotionally to do a few things, especially now. I don't think anybody would dispute the fact that our culture is becoming increasingly secular and also at the same time becoming aggressively hostile to Christianity and to the Catholic Church in particular. Does that ring true up here in Canada? I mean, do you have any things going on up here that might cause you to think that that's true? I mean, it's happening in the U.S. too. There's a law that is working its way through the lower intestine of the California legislature right now that it's not a law yet, but it's a bill that I expect will become law. And you may say, oh, well, it's already happening here in Canada. But California is my home state, so let me just give you this example. They're working on a bill that, if it becomes law, will make it illegal to, in any public way, radio, print, you name it, to say that there's anything wrong with or immoral with certain lifestyles. And if you do so, not only could you face personal penalties such as fines and even perhaps jail time, but also organizations that are on the air or broadcasting or printing or doing something else, they can be shut down. So we're entering into, I think we all know, we're entering into a time of great opposition to what we hold to be true, beginning with belief in God and certain other things. So I would say this is a time to rejoice. This is not a time to be afraid. This is not a time for us to wring our hands and woe is me and what will we do. We have to be not just joyful, but we have to be determined because as Catholics, we were made for this. The church was built for persecution. So rather than looking at what's going on around us and thinking, oh my gosh, we should see this as a huge opportunity. This is the best of times. Like the beginning line of the story, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I prefer to look at this as the best of times. We have such opportunities present before us, which is one reason why I was so happy to be invited to address you at this conference, because this is a way for us to collectively not only remind ourselves of what our mission is as Catholics, but also to encourage each other in how we should go about doing that. And I'll leave you with this final thought. Our message to the world does not need to be complicated. Does not need to be intricate. It does not require massive knowledge of Bible verses or logic. It's good to know those things, and to the extent you can know them, so much the better. But ultimately, what is required to be effective as apostles in the modern world that is hostile, increasingly hostile to what our message is, the most important things is to be willing to live the truth, to be willing to speak the truth, to be willing to suffer for the truth. I believe those three are the key ingredients. So let me share with you, in the brief few moments that I have left, some examples of what I mean by this. Living the truth, I think that's self-evident. If you are, for example, a family and you have more than the socially acceptable, say 2 children, then you are going to get some pushback, I'm quite sure. If you are a Catholic family who is living the Catholic faith in a way that's open to life, you're going to face the same kind of situation. And I dare say that people will see a large family as something to oppose. So living the faith is a great way to be, as Jesus said, a light shining in a dark place. He said, "You are the light of the world" in Matthew's gospel. No one lights a lamp and then hides it under a bushel basket, but it gives light to all in the house. He says, "So let your good works shine before men that they may give glory to your Father in heaven." The second area would be not being afraid to speak the truth. And as a quick example, my lovely wife, Nancy, she and I have 11 children, so that's a bit unusual in American culture to have 11 children. And by the way, this is not a Brady Bunch situation, so only one wife and no twins, no triplets. It's one by one of all the children, all happy and healthy children, thanks be to God. We have 6 boys, 5 girls, and they're all grown up now with children of their own. We now have 23 grandchildren and counting. And by the time my talk is finished, there may be 24. I'm looking to see if anyone's texting me. But So we've heard all the comments, people who say, "Don't you have a TV? Don't you know what causes that?" And my answer is, listen, if you prefer watching TV to what causes this, you got a big problem. That's all I can say. Ain't it the truth? So here's something that I learned, and this from my lovely wife, Nancy. We went to, one day, it was a busy day. We had about 9 kids living at home at this time, and our youngest was a newborn. And so I said to Nancy, "Honey, let's just go and get dinner, you and me. We'll let the kids fend for themselves, and you and me, we'll take the baby, we'll go have dinner." She's like, "Oh, that would be great." So we got the baby, we went to the local Olive Garden. And the waitress brings us to our booth, gives us our menus, and immediately, as women tend to do, she starts oohing and awing over the baby. Oh, boy or girl, how old? Typical questions. And then she asked the question that neither Nancy nor I wanted her to ask, which was, "Is he your first?" Because my wife is slim and lovely. She does not look like what I think people would have a stereotype of a lady who's had a lot of kids. She doesn't look like that. So it was not unreasonable that the waitress would ask her, "Is he your first?" So Nancy looks at me silently across the table. With her eyes, she says, "Do you want to tell her?" And I shook my head. "No, you can tell her." So she said to the waitress, she said, "No, he's our 11th. Now, this poor woman was so flustered, she didn't know how to act. So she ran off and she got 4 or 5 other waitresses, brought them to our table. Now, picture this scene here. So Nancy and I, the baby's there, and we now have like a cluster of 5 waitresses standing at our table looking at us like, "What is wrong with you people? Why would you have all those kids?" And they were saying, some negative comments like, "Why would you have 11 kids? And that's got to be so expensive." And I could see them looking at Nancy. I'm sure they were thinking, "You poor thing." And they'd look at me with that look that said, "You monster, how could you do this to your wife?" So in the middle of all this, then they start talking about their own personal contraceptive habits. So one waitress says, "Yeah, well, I'm on the pill. We have 2 kids. That's enough for me." The other one says, "Oh, well, I got my tubes tied." And the other one laughed and said, "Well, I made my husband get a vasectomy." And I'm sitting here thinking, I just want to have a plate of lasagna. This is information that is not helpful to me at this point right now. So it was all negative, and they were giving us these looks and all that. In the middle of all this, Nancy smiled at the waitresses, and in a very low-key, matter-of-fact tone of voice, she said, "Well, my husband and I believe that children are a blessing from God, and we believe in being open to life so that God will bless our marriage." And that's all she said. But it was enough, and the waitresses, they went back to their work, and we laughed. "Isn't that funny?" So 45 minutes later, I paid the bill, we got the baby, we went out to our minivan at the far end of the parking lot. It was dark. As we're getting into the vehicle, I hear footsteps running up behind us. So I turn around, I don't know who's coming up to us like that. It's our waitress. And she's out of breath. And she comes up, and under the street light above us, I could see tears glistening in her eyes and kind of huffing a little bit. She said, "Oh, I'm so glad I caught you. I just wanted to say thank you." And I knew she wasn't talking to me because the tip was not that big, honestly. So she was speaking to my wife. And she said, "What you said in there about children being a blessing from God and being open to life," she said, "I've never heard anyone say that." She said, "I realized that's true, and I want that." She said, "I'm on the pill, but when I get off my shift tonight and go home, I'm telling my husband I'm getting off the pill because I want God to bless our marriage, and I just wanted to say thank you for saying that." She gave Nancy a hug. She went back in the restaurant. We've never seen her again. But I do believe that at least one person is likely to come up to my wife in heaven and say, "Excuse me, you don't know me, but my mom was your waitress at the Olive Garden, and something you said led to me being here today, and I just wanted to say thank you." So I will conclude with one final thought, and then I'm finished. This is a very brief, true story. It is written in a book called Small Miracles. The man who wrote this, his name is Greg O'Leary. And the book by now, I believe, is out of print, but it'll only take me a moment to read this to you. It's in his own words, and it gets to that final point, which is to not be afraid to suffer for the truth. And I think you will understand why I say that when you hear these words. Listen. He says, "I was walking down a dimly lit street late one evening when I heard muffled screams coming from behind a clump of bushes. Alarmed, I slowed down to listen and panicked when I realized that what I was hearing were the unmistakable sounds of a struggle. Heaving, grunting, frantic scuffling, the tearing of fabric. Only yards from where I stood, a woman was being attacked. Should I get involved? I was frightened for my own safety and cursed myself for having suddenly decided to take a new route home that night. What if I became a victim? Shouldn't I just run away and call the police and let them handle it? Although it seemed like an eternity, the deliberations in my head had taken only seconds, but already the girl's cries were growing weaker. I knew I had to act fast. How could I walk away from this? No, I finally resolved I could not turn my back on the fate of this unknown woman, even if it meant risking my own life. I am not a brave man, nor am I athletic. I don't know where I found the moral courage and the physical strength, but once I had finally resolved to help the girl, I became strangely transformed. I ran behind the bushes, grabbed the assailant, and pulled him off the woman. Grappling and punching, we fell to the ground where we struggled for a few moments until the attacker jumped up and ran away. Panting hard, I scrambled upright and approached the girl who was crouched behind a tree sobbing. In the darkness, I could barely see her outline, but I could certainly sense her trembling shock. Not wanting to frighten her further, I at first spoke to her from a distance and said, "It's okay, you're safe now. The man ran away." There was a long pause, and then I heard her words uttered in wonder and amazement. "Dad, is that you?" And then from behind the tree stepped my youngest daughter, Catherine. Now, I leave you with this thought. What if that man had taken the coward's way out and had said, "I'll let somebody else handle it," and had gone home that evening and turned on the 11 o'clock news and had seen the picture of his own daughter being reported dead? For me, as a father and as a grandfather, I can't help every time I read that story to think about the duty that all of us have to do what we can to help save our culture, and in so doing, help save souls. That's what we're here to do, and I thank you very much for your kind attention. God bless you.